The dress still smelled like him. That was the worst part. Not the cold. Not the mud soaking through the thin soles of her shoes. Not the way the forest pressed in around her like walls closing in a room with no door. It was the smell. Cedar and iron, and something sweet that she had spent 2 years convincing herself meant safety. It clung to the fabric of her wedding gown like a stain that soap could not reach, like the kind of thing that only burned away. Bonnie pressed herself against the bark of an old pine and breathed. 1 breath, 2, 3. She told herself she was counting to stay calm. She was actually counting because if she stopped, if she let the silence fill her entirely, she would hear it again. That voice, low and certain, saying words not meant for her ears. She's useful until the ceremony is complete. After that, she becomes a liability. His voice, Kane's voice, the man she had married 4 hours ago, the man who had kissed her forehead at the altar with such practiced tenderness that she had actually cried. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and forced the sound down. Bonnie had never been the kind of woman who inspired grand gestures. She knew that. She had grown up knowing it. The Omega daughter of a disgraced line, taken in by the Voss pack after her father's death, tolerated more than welcomed, fed and clothed in exchange for usefulness. She had learned early how to make herself small, how to fold her opinions into silence, how to be grateful for scraps and call them feasts. When Kane Voss had chosen her out of every unmated woman in the territory, she had believed, with the full and terrible sincerity of someone who had never been chosen before, that it was real. She had been so careful not to want too much. She had been so careful. Her fingers found the torn edge of her veil and twisted it without thinking. The embroidered flowers her own hands had stitched in the months before the ceremony. White thread on white silk, tiny and meticulous, pressed into her palm. She had made it herself because Kane had said it was a lovely tradition. She understood now that he had said it because it cost him nothing to say it. The conversation she had overheard had not been long. That was almost the cruelest part of it. She had stepped away from the celebration early, slipping out through the side corridor that ran behind the great hall, intending only to find a moment of quiet before the night grew too loud. The Voss estate was not a warm place. All cold stone and high ceilings and tapestries hung more for status than comfort, and the noise of the feast had begun to press against the inside of her skull. She had only wanted 5 minutes. A window. Cool air. Instead, she had found Kane and his brother Petter standing in the narrow corridor with their backs to her, voices low. And she had heard every word before her body remembered how to stop. The Omega transfer. Is it signed? It will be. Once the bond is confirmed, her claim on the Ashvale land passes to the Voss name automatically. She doesn't know it's in the contract. And when it's done, then she's done. There had been a pause. A quiet, administrative pause, like 2 men discussing a property line. She's docile enough. She won't cause problems. She'd better not. Bonnie had not waited to hear more. She did not know how her feet had moved. She did not remember the side door, or the garden, or the iron gate at the edge of the estate grounds. She only knew that at some point the stone had become gravel, and the gravel had become earth, and the earth had become forest. And she was still in her wedding gown, with the smell of cedar and iron wrapped around her like something she could not take off. She had been walking for over an hour. Her feet were wet now. The satin shoes, pale as new milk, and never meant for anything rougher than a marble floor, had given up entirely somewhere around the 2nd stream crossing. She had kept going. The forest was dense here, old pines and silver birch tangled together, and the moon was still generous enough to stripe the ground in thin white light. She followed it without direction, without plan. The only thought she had managed to hold clearly was this: do not stop. If she stopped, they would find her. If they found her, she would be returned. If she was returned. Bonnie cut the thought off cleanly, the way she had learned to cut off anything that could make her crumble when she could not afford to. She pushed off the tree and kept walking. The Ashvale land. She turned the words over slowly, carefully, the way you'd handle something sharp. She had known, in a distant way, that her father had left her something. A territory in the northern reach, a name in an old ledger, some claim that had never been explained to her fully because the Voss family had handled her father's estate, and they had handled her along with it. She had been 23 when he died, grief-dazed and rootless. She had signed what they put in front of her. She understood now what she had signed. The cold was worsening. She could feel it moving through the wet fabric of the gown, settling into her bones with patient thoroughness. And she registered it with the distant clarity of someone whose body had already decided that survival was more important than comfort. Her wolf was quiet, had been quiet for years, truthfully, suppressed by some combination of grief and fear, and the particular exhaustion of living in a place where being too much of anything was dangerous. She could feel her, though, a low warmth in the center of her chest, not rising, just present. Keep going, that warmth seemed to say. Not yet. Not here. She was crossing a ridge when she heard it. Not footsteps. Not pursuit. Something else. A sound she had heard once before, years ago. When she was a child, and her father had taken her to the border of Ravenmoor territory, and told her, very quietly, to stay very still. A sound like wind moving through something large, like the forest itself, taking a breath. Bonnie stopped. In the clearing below the ridge, lit by the full face of the moon, a wolf stood watching her, not pacing, not circling, standing entirely still, the way wolves almost never stood, with a quality of attention that was not animal, or not only animal. He was enormous. Not in the way that made her think of threat, though threat was certainly there, underneath it the way bedrock was underneath soil. He was black as ink poured into shadow, large enough that the trees behind him seemed merely decorative, and he was looking at her with eyes that were pale as winter light and completely, disconcertingly calm. She should have run. She knew she should have run. Every reasonable part of her mind assembled the argument with great efficiency. Unknown wolf, unknown territory, wedding gown, no pack, no backup, no wolf of her own reliably present. Run. Her feet did not move. The wolf took one step forward, just one, then stopped again, as if he understood something about thresholds. Bonnie's hands were shaking. From cold, she told herself, only from cold. And her breath came in visible clouds between them. She watched him. He watched her. The forest made no sound. Then slowly, without any of the violence she had braced for, the enormous black wolf lowered himself to the ground. Not aggressively. Not to spring. He lay down in the snow-dusted pine needles with a kind of deliberate care, his great head resting on his forepaws, those pale eyes still steady on her face, like he was making himself smaller, like he was waiting. Bonnie stood there in her ruined wedding gown, soaked through, freezing, with no plan and no direction, and the smell of a man she despised still clinging to her skin, and stared at a wolf who was looking at her the way no one had looked at her in a very long time, like she was something worth being still for. She did not trust it. She did not trust any of it. But her legs, which had carried her through an hour of cold forest, chose that moment to finally give way, and she sat down in the pine needles 6 feet from a wolf she did not know, in the ruins of a life that had never been hers, and pressed her face into her hands. She did not cry loudly. She never did. But the shaking took her anyway, quiet and thorough. And the wolf did not move, and the moon did not look away, and the forest held its breath around them both like something very old and very patient, waiting to see what she would do next. She woke to warmth. That was the first wrong thing. Not wrong like danger, but wrong like something that did not belong to her life as she knew it. Warmth had always been conditional in Bonnie's world. Earned, rationed, withdrawn without notice. The warmth she woke to now was different. It came from every direction at once, from below and above, and the air itself, heavy and clean with the smell of pine resin and wood smoke, and something faintly herbal she could not name. She opened her eyes slowly. Stone ceiling, timber beams. A fire burning in a wide hearth to her left, the kind built into the wall itself, old and deep and large enough to stand inside. She was in a bed. A real bed. Not a servant's cot like the one she had slept in for 2 years at the Voss estate, with linen sheets that smelled of lavender and beeswax, and a heavy wool blanket pulled to her chin. Her wedding gown was gone. She was wearing a plain sleep shift, loose and clean, and someone had unbraided her hair. Bonnie sat up so quickly the room tilted. Slowly. The voice came from the chair beside the hearth. Low. Even. The kind of voice that did not raise itself to be heard, because it had never needed to. The man sitting there was not looking at her. He was reading, or had been reading, a leather-bound volume resting open across one knee. And he turned the page before he looked up, as if finishing the thought first. When he did look up, Bonnie felt something shift in her chest, in a way she immediately distrusted. He was large in the way the wolf had been large. Not exaggerated, but undeniable. The kind of size that rearranged a room simply by being present in it. Dark hair, cut short at the sides and longer at the crown, pushed back from a face that was all clean angles and controlled expression. His eyes were pale. Winter light pale. The same eyes that had watched her from the clearing. She knew it before he said a word. "You shifted back," she said, and it came out more accusing than she intended. "Some time ago." He closed the book, set it on the small table beside the chair, with quiet precision. "You were asleep. You carried me here. You had stopped moving. The temperature was dropping." He said it simply, without particular warmth or coldness, like a man stating geography. It was not a complicated decision. Bonnie pulled the wool blanket higher, not because she was cold. The room was far too warm for cold, but because she needed something to do with her hands that was not revealing. She looked around the room more carefully now. Large, but not opulent. Functional stone walls, a writing desk, bookshelves filling 2 full walls floor to ceiling, a window with heavy curtains drawn against the dark, candles burning in iron holders, a water basin on a stand near the door with a clean cloth folded beside it. Everything was orderly. Everything was chosen with care and without excess. Not a guest room. She could feel that instinctively. This was a room someone lived in. "Whose room is this?" she asked. "Mine." He watched her process that. "You can have it. I'll sleep elsewhere." "I don't want your room." "You needed warmth and rest. Both are here." He tilted his head slightly. "Where would you prefer?" Bonnie opened her mouth and then closed it, because the honest answer was that she had no preference. She had nowhere to go, no direction that was safe, no person in the known world she could arrive at without risk. That truth sat in her throat like a stone. The man stood. He was taller than she had estimated from the chair, which was saying something. He moved to the water basin, poured from the ceramic jug beside it, and carried the cup to the small table near the bed, setting it down without approaching closer than necessary. "Drink," he said. "There are herbs in it. For the cold you're going to have by morning." She looked at the cup. He saw her looking. "It is not poisoned," he said, and something in his tone shifted just slightly. Not offense, exactly, but recognition, like he understood why she was checking. "You'd say that either way," she said. Yes, he agreed. I would. He stepped back and returned to his chair, sat, reopened his book. So would anyone. Drink it or don't. It's your choice. Bonnie stared at him for a long moment. Then she reached for the cup. It tasted of ginger and something bitter underneath, and it spread through her chest like a slow fire. She drank it all. Who are you? She asked when the cup was empty. He looked up from the book. Those pale eyes settled on her with that same quality she had felt in the clearing. Complete attention, no performance in it. Evander, he said. This is Dunmere, Northern Reach. Bonnie's fingers tightened on the empty cup. Northern Reach. She was in the Northern Reach. She had walked further than she realized, or he had carried her further than the clearing. Either way, Northern Reach. The words her father had left her, the claim she had never been allowed to understand. Asheville Land, Northern Reach. You know who I am, she said. It was not a question. I know you were running from the Voss estate in a wedding gown on the coldest night of the month, he said. I know your feet were bleeding and you sat down in the snow and didn't make a sound loud enough to call for help. He paused. I know your name is Bonnie. The rest I learned from context. Context? She repeated flatly. Your father was Edmund Asheville. He said it without ceremony, the way he seemed to say everything. He and I had an agreement, years ago, unfinished when he died. He watched her face carefully. I did not know he had a daughter until recently. I did not know what the Voss family had done with her. The fire popped and settled. Bonnie set the cup down on the bed table and looked at her own hands, which were scraped at the knuckles where she had caught herself falling somewhere in the forest. Someone had cleaned the cuts. Small, careful lines of dried salve ran across the worst of them. What kind of agreement? She asked, the kind that matters more now than it did then. He turned another page, though she doubted he was reading. We can discuss it when you're not exhausted and half frozen. I'd rather discuss it now. He looked up. For the first time, something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. A recognition of her stubbornness that did not seem to displease him. The Asheville territory, he said, borders Dunmere on the eastern side. When your father died, it should have passed to his bloodline. It did not. The Voss family filed a claim of guardianship over the heir and used it to freeze the inheritance and administrative hold. Legal enough to stand unchallenged, not legal enough to survive a direct contest. He closed the book for the second time. You are the direct heir. The land is yours. The Voss family has been drawing resources from it for 3 years under false stewardship, and the contract your new husband had you sign today completed their transfer claim. Bonnie heard every word. She heard them land one by one like stones dropped into still water. How do you know about the contract? She asked carefully. Because I have eyes in places the Voss family doesn't know to look. He met her gaze. And because Cain Voss came to me 6 months ago to propose an alliance. I declined. Part of why I declined was that I did not like what I was told about how he intended to secure the Asheville claim. Something in his jaw tightened very briefly. I did not know, at that point, that the heir was already in his house. The silence stretched between them. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Somewhere deeper in the building, Bonnie heard something small and indistinct. A voice, high and brief, quickly hushed. Then quiet again. You have people here, she said. I have a household, he said, and 3 sons. He said the second part, with a particular quality of stillness, as if laying something on a table and waiting to see how she received it. Aged 9, 7, and 4. Their mother died 2 years ago. Bonnie looked at him. He looked back, and there was something in his face now that was different from the controlled authority of everything before. Not grief, exactly. Or not only grief. Something more complex. The face of a man who had made peace with loss without pretending it hadn't happened. She did not know what to say. She said the only honest thing she had. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, accepted it without deflecting. Then he stood again, and this time he moved toward the door, lifting a heavy wool robe from the hook beside it and draping it over the back of the nearest chair, within reach of the bed. "Sleep," he said. "The door has no lock on the outside, only the inside." He said it plainly, without making a performance of the reassurance. "In the morning, if you choose to leave, I'll have someone take you wherever you want to go. If you choose to stay, we'll talk about your options." He paused with his hand on the door. "You have more of them than you think." He left without waiting for her answer. The door clicked shut with quiet finality. Bonnie sat in the warm room, in the borrowed shift, with the smell of wood smoke replacing cedar and iron, and looked at the fire for a long time. She did not feel safe. She was not certain she remembered how that felt, but she felt something smaller and more immediate, the specific, fragile sensation of a threat that had briefly stepped back, of a room where no one needed anything from her tonight. She lay back down. She did not sleep quickly, but when she did not dream of Kane Voss. She dreamed of land, wide and cold and northern and hers. Morning came gray and honest, the way mornings did in the north. No gradual softening, no gentle gold at the window's edge, just light arriving like a fact. Bonnie was already awake when it came. She had been awake for some time, sitting at the edge of the bed with the wool robe around her shoulders, watching the fire burn down to quiet coals and thinking with the particular clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. She had made a list in her head, not of feelings. Feelings were a luxury she could not afford yet, but of facts. 1. Her marriage to Kane Voss was legally completed. The ceremony had been witnessed, the record signed. Whatever he had intended by it was already in motion. 2. The contract she had signed at the altar, the one she had not read carefully because Kane had placed his hand over hers and looked at her with such calm affection that she had trusted the warmth of it more than the words, had transferred her claim on the Ashvale land to the Voss name. 3. She had run, which meant Kane knew she had heard something, or would know by morning that she was gone, which amounted to the same problem. 4. She was in Dunmere, in the home of a man she did not know, who had carried her out of the forest, who claimed to have known her father, who had pale eyes and a quality of stillness that she did not entirely know what to do with. 5. She had nothing. No coin, no clothes beyond a borrowed shift and robe, no documentation, no pack affiliation, no wolf reliably present. The Voss family had her name on a contract, and 3 years of false stewardship behind them, and a social standing she could not match on her own. She sat with those facts for a long time. Then she stood up, washed her face in the basin. The water was cold and clean and smelled faintly of mineral stone. Braided her hair back from her face with the practical efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that appearances were a form of armor, and went to find Evander. The hallway outside the room was stone and timber, lit by narrow windows and iron candle brackets not yet lit in the morning gray. It was quiet in a way that felt inhabited rather than empty, the quiet of a house where people were awake but moving carefully, aware of early hours. She followed the smell of bread and fire downward through a staircase that curved twice before opening into a wide corridor, and the corridor led her to a kitchen so large and warm that she stopped in the doorway for a moment, simply from the shock of it. 3 faces turned toward her. The eldest boy, 9 years old, she recalled, with dark hair and his father's pale eyes set in a rounder, younger face, was sitting at the long table with a book open in front of him that he clearly had not been reading, because he had been watching the door. The middle child, 7, had flour on both hands and a smear of it across one cheek, and the focused expression of someone engaged in something very important involving dough. The youngest, 4, small enough that the kitchen stool he sat on made him look like something placed there decoratively, was eating porridge with great seriousness and did not look up at all. A woman in a gray apron stood at the hearth, older, with a broad, capable face, and the kind of posture that came from decades of running a household with complete authority. She looked at Bonnie without surprise, which meant she had been told to expect her. "Sit," the woman said, in a tone that brooked no social negotiation. "I'm Hesta. I run this kitchen and everything adjacent to it. You'll have porridge and bread, and if you argue with me about it, I'll give you twice as much." Bonnie sat. The eldest boy had not stopped watching her. He did it without rudeness, just steadily, with that unnerving quality of assessment that she recognized as his father's. "You were in the forest," he said. "Aldrich," said Hesta, without turning from the hearth. "I'm only saying what I know," Aldrich said, with the particular dignity of a 9-year-old defending accuracy. He looked back at Bonnie. "Father brought you in before dawn. You were asleep." "I was," Bonnie agreed. "Were you lost?" She considered the question seriously, because it deserved seriousness. "Not exactly," she said. "I knew where I was going. I just didn't know where that was yet." Aldrich considered this. Something in his expression shifted toward cautious respect. The middle boy, she would learn his name was Emmerich, deposited a misshapen piece of dough on the table in front of her with great ceremony. "I made that," he said. "It's bread, mostly." "It looks excellent," Bonnie said. Emmerich beamed and went back to his work. The youngest, whose name she had not yet learned, looked up from his porridge for the first time, looked at her with an expression of complete neutrality, and then held out his spoon toward her in what she slowly understood was an offer to share. "Thank you," she said softly. "I have my own." He withdrew the spoon and returned to his porridge, apparently satisfied. Hesta set a bowl in front of her, thick oat porridge with something dark and sweet stirred through it, and a heel of dense bread alongside, and Bonnie ate without speaking, because the food was real and the kitchen was warm, and she had not eaten since the wedding feast, where she had been too nervous to eat much of anything at all. She was hungrier than she had realized. She did not apologize for it. She was on her second piece of bread when Evander came in. He had clearly been outside. There was cold air still on him, and he was pulling off leather riding gloves as he ducked through the lower doorframe, and his boots had mud at the heel. He stopped when he saw her at the table, and something in him settled, very slightly, in a way she might not have noticed if she had not been watching carefully. He was watching her the same way. "You stayed," he said. "I had porridge to finish," she said. Emmerich laughed, sudden and bright. Aldrich almost smiled. Evander looked at her for a moment with that unreadable expression, and then went to pour water from the jug by the window. They did not speak again, until the boys had been directed toward their morning lessons by Hesta, with the efficient authority of someone who had clearly been doing so for years. Then the kitchen was quiet except for the fire, and Evander sat down across the table from Bonnie with a cup of water and a directness that she had already started to recognize as simply how he was. "I sent word this morning," he said, "to my legal counsel in the East Reach, about the Ashvale contract." Bonnie set her cup down. "You did that without asking me." "I did," he said. "I'm asking now. Do you want me to stop?" She looked at him. He waited. "What does your legal counsel do with it?" she asked. "Examines the original land charter. Cross-references the guardianship claim the Voss family filed when your father died. Determines whether the transfer contract you signed today is legally binding under Northern Reach law, given that it was not disclosed to you as a condition of the marriage." He said it clearly, without drama, the way she imagined he said most things, If the contract was buried in ceremony documentation, and you were not made aware of its terms in plain language, it can be challenged. Can it be won? Possibly. More possibly if you're standing in Dunmere when the challenge is filed, under my name as a supporting party, than if you're standing alone. Bonnie was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted and resettled. Why would you do that? She asked, not suspiciously. She had moved past performing suspicion for its own sake. She asked it as a real question. You don't know me. I knew your father, he said. He was an honest man in a system that punishes honesty. He deserved better than what happened to his estate. He looked at his cup. You deserved better than what happened to you. That's not a sufficient reason, she said. Plenty of people deserve better. That doesn't make it your obligation. He looked up then, and there was something in the steadiness of it that made her want to look away, but also made her refuse to. No, he agreed. It's not only that. He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, with that same quality of placing something on a table and waiting, he said, This is a large house. My sons need stability. Hesta is extraordinary, but she is not young, and she cannot be everything. I need someone I can trust in this household, not a political arrangement or a pack obligation. He paused. You need somewhere to be while you fight for what's yours. Somewhere Cain Voss cannot reach without crossing into my territory and answering for it. Bonnie looked at him for a long time. You're offering me a home, she said slowly. In exchange for... Nothing, he said. I'm offering you a home. What you do with the time you have here is yours to decide. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite vulnerability, but the edge of it. My sons have had enough of people who stay only because they have to. The words landed quietly and did not leave. She thought of Aldrich's steady watching eyes, of Emmerich's flower-covered hands, of the youngest child offering his spoon to a stranger with complete and uncomplicated generosity. She thought of the Ashvale land, cold and northern and waiting, which had been hers all along. She thought of the smell of cedar and iron, and how thoroughly the wood smoke had replaced it. I'll stay, she said, for now. It was not a declaration. She did not mean it as one. But Evander received it with a nod that was neither relieved nor triumphant, only present, only real. And that, too, she filed away in the part of her mind that was slowly, carefully, taking notes on what honesty looked like when it had nothing to prove. 3 weeks passed before Cain Voss made his move. Bonnie had expected it sooner. She had spent the first days in Dunmere with one ear always toward the gate, waking at sounds that turned out to be wind or the creak of old timber, watching the road from the high window of the room that had become, quietly and without ceremony, hers. Evander had moved his books to the study down the corridor without comment. Hesta had appeared the second morning with a stack of folded clothes, plain wool dresses, a winter cloak, sturdy boots in the right size, and had set them on the chair without making anything of it. And Bonnie had understood that this was how things worked in Dunmere. Needs were observed and met without theater. She was not used to that. She kept waiting for the cost. In the absence of immediate crisis, she learned the house. It was larger than it appeared from the inside. 3 floors of working stone, a stable yard at the back, a small training ground beyond that where Evander ran drills with his guard in the early mornings, a library that occupied most of the second floor's eastern wing, and smelled permanently of old leather and pine resin. She spent a great deal of time in the library. It felt like the safest room in the building, not because of walls or locks, but because it was the one place in the house where no one needed anything from her, and she could simply exist inside her own thinking. She found her father's name in 3 different texts, a land charter from 40 years prior, his signature a clean cursive at the bottom of the 3rd page, a record of Northern Reach Council membership, his seat listed without comment, and a personal correspondence file, bound in brown cord, that she almost missed entirely because it had been shelved between two much larger volumes on pack law. She sat on the library floor for 2 hours, reading letters her father had written to Evander over the course of a decade, beginning when she had been 12 years old and ending 6 months before his death. They were not dramatic letters. That was what undid her, quietly and completely. They were letters between two men who respected each other, about land management, about council politics, about the slow corruption of the Southern pack alliances, about a daughter her father mentioned in passing with a particular tenderness that she had to read 3 times before she believed she was seeing it correctly. Bonnie learned to ride this summer. She's not natural at it yet, but she refuses to stop trying. I think she has more iron in her than she knows. I hope she never has to find out how much. She folded that letter very carefully and put it back exactly where she had found it. Then she sat very still for a while and did not cry, but came near enough to it that she was glad the library was empty. It was Aldrich who found her there later, when the afternoon light had gone amber and low. He did not ask what she was doing on the floor. He simply sat down beside her with his own book and read in companionable silence until Hesta called them both for supper, and Bonnie thought, not for the first time, that 9 years old was old enough to understand more than people gave it credit for. The messenger from Voss arrived on a Tuesday, gray-skied and cold, with 2 escorts who wore the Voss colors and expressions calibrated to project authority. Bonnie watched from the upper window as Evander met them in the courtyard alone, no guard at his back, no display. And she noticed the way the escorts, who had arrived with squared shoulders and lifted chins, slowly recalibrated their posture as the conversation continued. By the end, they were standing differently. Smaller, without quite knowing why. Evander came to find her afterward. She was in the library, because she was always in the library. He set a folded letter on the table in front of her and sat down across from it, in the chair on the other side of the reading table, and waited while she read. The letter was from Kane. It was written in the formal language of pack law, which was designed to sound reasonable while saying something ruthless. It requested, that was the word used, the return of his wife to the Voss estate, citing the completed marriage bond and his legal obligation to ensure her welfare. It noted, with careful neutrality, that her departure represented a breach of ceremonial contract. It mentioned in the final paragraph, and only once, that the Ashvale transfer had been filed with the Southern Territorial Council that morning. Bonnie read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at her own hands on the table. "He moved faster than I expected," she said. "He's afraid," Evander said. "Afraid means rushed. Rushed means mistakes. What mistakes has he made?" He filed the transfer claim before confirming the marriage was consummated and the bond established. Under Northern Reach law, a land transfer through marriage requires bond confirmation, not just ceremony record. His counsel either didn't know that or assumed you would never be in a position to challenge it. He paused. He also filed with the Southern Council, not the Northern. The Ashvale land is under Northern jurisdiction. Bonnie looked up. That invalidates the filing. "It makes it challengeable," he said carefully. "Not automatically void. But my counsel filed a counterclaim this morning under Northern jurisdiction, citing your presence here as Northern Reach resident and the procedural error in Voss's filing. There will be a council hearing." "When?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She held that timeline in her mind and measured it against everything she knew about the Voss family's patience, which was not considerable. "He'll come himself," she said, "before the hearing. He'll try something." "Yes," Evander said. He did not soften it. "Your men are more than adequate," he said it without arrogance. "And Dunmere's borders are not the Voss estate's borders. Anything he attempts here carries political consequences he cannot afford." Bonnie nodded. Then, because it had been sitting in her chest for 3 weeks, and she was tired of carrying it alone. "The letters," she said. "In the library. My father's correspondence." Evander was still for a moment. "I found them by accident," she said. "I wasn't looking." "I know," he said. "I should have told you they were there. I thought—" He stopped. Considered. "I wasn't sure how much you knew about him. About who he was before you lost him." "I knew him," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "I just didn't know he'd said those things to someone else." She looked at the window. "He wrote that he hoped I'd never have to find out how much iron I had." Evander said nothing. He did not fill the silence with comfort, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated comfort. "He was right that I had it," she said. "He was wrong that I'd never need it." "He was a father," Evander said quietly. "They hope that, even when they know better." She looked at him then. Really looked, the way she had been careful not to do too directly since she had arrived. Because looking at Evander too directly felt like standing too close to a fire that she had not decided yet whether she trusted. He was looking at the window, not at her. His jaw was set. There was something in his profile that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She thought about 2 sons and a youngest child, and a mother who had not come back from somewhere. She did not ask. Not yet. But she filed it away with everything else she was learning about what honesty looked like when it carried weight. The trouble came on a Thursday, before the 6 weeks were up. Not Kane himself. That would have been too direct. And Kane Voss was not a direct man. It came in the form of a woman. A distant Voss relation named Sarah, who arrived at Dunmere's gate claiming sanctuary from a violent mate, weeping with accomplished helplessness, and was let in by a young gate guard who had not yet learned the difference between distress and performance. Bonnie saw her from across the entrance hall and felt something move in her chest that was not her own emotion. It was lower, older, a warning that rose from somewhere beneath thought. Her wolf, who had been growing steadily less quiet over 3 weeks of rest and safety and regular meals, lifted her head in the interior darkness where she lived and said, very clearly, "No." Bonnie crossed the hall before she had decided to. "What's your name?" she asked, stepping between Sarah and the interior corridor. Sarah blinked at her with reddened eyes. "I told your guard." "I heard what you told my guard," Bonnie said. Her voice was calm, completely calm, and she was faintly surprised by it. "I'm asking what your name is." Something shifted in Sarah's expression. Fractional, gone in an instant. But Bonnie had spent 2 years in the Voss estate reading rooms full of people who were performing feelings they did not have, and she had gotten very good at the tells. Evander appeared in the corridor behind her. She did not look back at him. "She's Voss," Bonnie said quietly. "She was sent." "I can—" Sarah began. "You have a letter," Bonnie said, "or a package, or something you were meant to leave somewhere in this house, or something you were meant to put in food or drink, or you were meant to assess our defenses and report back." She kept her voice even, informational. "I don't know which one yet, but I know which family sent you, and I know it was not kindness." The silence in the entrance hall was absolute. Sarah's performance cracked along a single line, like ice under weight. Something harder appeared underneath it, and then she lifted her chin with the dignity of someone deciding that a failed mission was still a mission, and did not say another word. Evander handled what came next with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything. The guard was spoken to privately, and without cruelty.
Sarah was held in the gatehouse under watch until she could be escorted back to Voss territory with a written message that Evander composed in Bonnie's presence, at her request, and read aloud before sealing. "The attempt has been noted. The hearing will proceed. Any further contact with Dunmere residents will be treated as a territorial violation under Northern Reach law and answered accordingly." When it was done, when the gatehouse door was closed and the courtyard quiet again,
Evander turned and looked at her with something new in his expression. Not surprise. She didn't think surprise was something he did easily. Something more like recognition. The specific look of someone who has been paying careful attention and has just had a theory confirmed. "How did you know?" he asked. "I lived with them for 3 years," she said. "I know what a Voss face looks like when it's working." He was quiet for a moment. Then, Bonnie. It was the first time he had said her name. Just that, her name, the way it sounded in his voice, level and low and somehow entirely unlike the way anyone else had ever said it. And she felt it move through her in a way she refused, firmly and immediately to examine. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we prepare for the hearing." She nodded. She walked past him toward the stairs. She did not let herself look back. But she heard him, very quietly, tell the guard at the inner door to double the watch. And she heard the care and the instruction. And she carried that up the stairs with her like something she had not meant to pick up, but could not put back down. The hearing was held in Gravane, the Northern Reaches council seat, in a building so old that the stone walls had absorbed decades of judgment into their very grain. Bonnie had never been inside it before. She walked through the entrance with Evander at her left and his legal counsel at her right, and kept her spine straight and her face composed, because she had learned long ago that composure was the one form of armor no one could take from you. The hall was full. She had not expected that. She had imagined something smaller, more administrative, a table, a few council members, documents exchanged across cold stone. What she found instead was a gallery packed with observers from a dozen packs, northern and southern both, who had apparently decided that the question of the Ashvale land and the woman who had fled her own wedding was worth traveling to see resolved. She felt their eyes move over her as she entered and made herself feel nothing about it, which was a skill she had refined over years of being looked at as a category rather than a person. Kane was already there. He was seated on the opposing side of the central table with 2 counselors and his brother Peter, and when Bonnie entered, he turned and looked at her with an expression she recognized with cold clarity, the expression of a man who had expected her to be smaller by now, diminished, frightened back into compliance by 3 weeks of uncertainty. She watched him recalibrate as he took in her posture, her clothes, clean wool and a dark cloak, simple and unapologetic, and the fact that she was walking beside Evander of Dunmere without hesitation. Something moved behind Kane's eyes. Not guilt. Men like Kane did not carry guilt in places where it could be seen. It was something more practical. The first real acknowledgement that this was not going to go the way he had planned. Good, Bonnie thought. Let him see it clearly. The council chair, an elder woman named Soraeus with white hair and the expression of someone who had heard every possible human argument and found most of them tedious, opened the proceedings without ceremony. Documents were presented. The original Ashvale land charter, the guardianship claim the Voss family had filed after her father's death, the marriage contract with its buried transfer clause, the counterclaim filed from Dunmere. Bonnie's counsel spoke first, and then Kane's. And then Soraeus asked questions in a voice that was scrupulously neutral and eyes that were anything but. She had the manner of someone following a thread she had already seen the end of. Then Soraeus looked at Bonnie directly. "You signed the transfer document," she said, not accusingly, factually. "I did," Bonnie said. Her voice carried cleanly across the hall. "I was not told what it was. It was presented as part of the ceremony record. I was told to sign where indicated." "You did not read it." "I was not given time to read it. The document was placed before me during the ceremony itself, between the vow exchange and the blessing. My husband's hand was over mine when I signed." She paused. "I was 26 years old. I had lived in the Voss household as a dependent for 3 years. And the man placing the document before me had spent 2 years establishing my trust, specifically so that I would not question him in that moment. The gallery was very quiet. "That is a serious characterization," Soraya said. "Yes," Bonnie said. "It is." Kane's counsel began to speak. Bonnie did not look at him. She looked at Sorayas, and Sorayas looked back, and something moved between them that was not legal argument. It was simpler than that. Older, the particular recognition between women who understood what it cost to say a true thing in a room full of people who would prefer a more convenient version. It was Petter who broke it. She had not expected it from him, had not in truth thought of Petter as a significant variable, because in her experience, he had always been the quieter instrument of Kane's intentions, rather than a force of his own. But something in the proceedings had clearly unsettled whatever calculation he had made coming in, because he leaned toward Kane with a hissed instruction that was not quiet enough. And what he said: "We should have finished this before she reached the north. I told you the Ashvale girl would be a problem if she ever found out." Carried to the first 3 rows of the gallery with perfect, damning clarity. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Kane closed his eyes for precisely 2 seconds. When he opened them, the expression of composed confidence was still there, but it had the quality of something maintained by effort rather than conviction. Sorayas did not look at Peter. She continued looking at Bonnie. "Is there anything further you wish to present?" she asked. Bonnie's counsel slid a final document across the table. "The record of Voss stewardship over Ashvale land for 3 years, he said, "including resource extraction records filed under the false guardianship claim, totaling." He named a figure that moved through the gallery like a stone through water, drawn from land that legally remained in the Ashvale bloodline throughout. The hearing lasted another hour. It felt much shorter. When Sorayas delivered the council's finding, she did it in the same flat, unhurried voice she had used for everything else, as if the weight of what she was saying did not require amplification. The transfer contract was void, procedurally invalid under Northern Reach jurisdiction, and additionally tainted by the documented circumstances of its signing. The Ashvale land reverted to its legal heir. The Voss family's stewardship claim was dissolved retroactively. A formal inquiry would be opened into the 3 years of resource extraction. As for the marriage itself, Sorayas paused there and looked at Bonnie with something that was almost, but not quite, an expression. Northern Reach law recognized grounds for dissolution when a marriage contract was found to contain undisclosed material terms. Bonnie would need to file separately, but the grounds existed. Kane stood. "This council does not have the authority to—" "Sit down, Alpha Voss," Sorayas said, in a voice like a door closing. He sat. Bonnie looked at him then. She allowed herself that. One long, clear look at the man who had kissed her forehead at an altar and called it tenderness, who had chosen her specifically because she was rootless and grateful and unlikely to fight back, who had looked at her father's land and seen an acquisition, and looked at his father's ward and seen a tool. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. Not triumph, exactly. Not the hot satisfaction of revenge she had imagined in the forest, in the cold, in the weeks of waiting. What she felt was quieter and more permanent. The specific sensation of a weight that had been attached to her without her knowledge finally being removed. The feeling of standing at her own full height for the first time in years. She turned away from him. She did not look back. Outside, in the gray vein air, Evander's counsel was already discussing next steps with focused efficiency. Bonnie stood on the council steps and breathed, cold, clean, pine-sharp northern air, and let the morning settle around her. Evander came to stand beside her. Not close enough to crowd, close enough to be present. They stood in silence for a moment. "It's done," she said. "The legal part," he said. "The rest takes longer." She knew he was right. The inquiry would take months. The marriage dissolution would require its own filing, its own waiting, Cain Voss would not disappear from the world simply because a council had ruled against him. He would be smaller, diminished, his ambitions checked. But he would still exist, and men like that required watching. But the land was hers. Her name was on a document that could not be taken from her, and she was standing in the north, in clean air, beside a man who had not once asked her to be smaller. "Evander," she said. He looked at her. She had thought about this moment, not planned it exactly, but turned it over in the quiet of the library and the early mornings and the hours she had spent learning what his household sounded like when it was simply itself. She had thought about the letters, about her father's handwriting, about the way Aldrich watched the door, about Emmerich's flower-covered hands, about the youngest child, whose name was Finn, she had learned, and who had recently decided that she was the appropriate person to present with interesting rocks he found in the garden, a responsibility she had accepted with complete seriousness. She had thought about what it meant to stay somewhere, not because you had no choice, but because the place had become, without your full permission, the place your chest recognized as real. "I'd like to go home," she said. Something moved in Evander's face, deep and controlled and entirely genuine. "Then let's go home," he said. They rode back to Dunmare in the late afternoon, when the light came low and golden through the pines, and the road was quiet, and the cold had the clean quality of somewhere real. Bonnie rode without speaking, and did not feel the silence as empty. She felt it as full of everything that had been said, and everything that did not need to be said yet, and the particular weight of a future that was, for the first time, actually hers to build. The gate was open when they arrived. Hesta was in the courtyard, which meant she had been watching the road. Emmerich ran out before the horses had fully stopped, and began talking immediately about something that had happened to the bread, which apparently involved Finn, and a significant quantity of rosemary. Aldrich stood at the top of the entrance steps with his book under his arm, and watched her dismount, and when she looked up at him, he gave her the small, serious nod of someone formally acknowledging a return. She nodded back, equally seriously. Finn appeared in the doorway behind Aldrich, saw her, and held up a rock. It was not a particularly remarkable rock. Gray, slightly muddy, ordinary in every measurable way. He was holding it up with the specific pride of someone who had been saving it. Bonnie walked up the steps and took the rock from his small hands and looked at it with appropriate gravity. "This is a very good one," she said. Finn nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. That night, after supper, after the boys were in bed and Hesta had retired and the house had settled into its particular nighttime quiet, Bonnie sat in the library with her father's letters in her lap and did not read them. She just held them. The fire burned low. The candles guttered in some draft from the old stones. Outside, snow had begun, the first real snow of the season, coming down in the quiet way that meant it intended to stay. She heard Evander's step in the corridor before he appeared in the doorway. He did not come in. He stood there with one hand on the frame, looking at her with that steady winter-light attention, and she looked back without looking away. "He hoped I'd never have to find out," she said, meaning her father, meaning the iron. "I know," Evander said. "I'm glad I did," she said. "Find out." He was quiet for a moment. The snow came down outside the high window in long, unhurried lines. Then he said, simply and without decoration, the way he said everything that mattered, "So am I." He did not come in. He did not need to, not yet. There was time now, real time, the kind that belonged to them and could be moved through without urgency. But he stayed in the doorway a while longer, and she stayed in the chair, and the fire kept burning, and the snow kept falling, and the house breathed around them with the deep, unhurried rhythm of somewhere that had finally, after a long time of holding its breath, decided to rest. The Ashvale land was surveyed the following spring. Bonnie rode every boundary herself, On a horse Evander chose for her without comment. Sturdy, intelligent, with a streak of stubbornness she appreciated. She had her father's letters with her, in a satchel, not to consult, but to carry. The land was cold and northern and wider than she had imagined, and standing at its easternmost border, she could see the outer walls of Dunmere in the distance, pale against the tree line. She married Evander quietly, in Dunmere's entrance hall, 6 months after the council hearing, with Hesta and Aldrich and Emmerich and Finn as witnesses, and no elaborate ceremony and no document placed before her without her reading every word. Soraeus herself performed the formal record, having apparently decided that some things were worth the travel. The Asheville land and Dunmere's eastern territory were formally joined in the record that same day, under both names. Cain Voss was found to have conducted fraudulent stewardship across 4 separate inherited estates, Ashevale being only the most recent. The inquiry took 8 months. At its conclusion, he was stripped of his Alpha title, his council standing dissolved, his family's claim on the Southern Pack leadership suspended pending further review. Petters overheard words in the hearing gallery had been recorded by 2 council scribes and entered into testimony. It had not, in the end, required elaborate strategy. It had only required one sentence said too loudly in a room that was paying attention. Aldrich grew into a young man with his father's eyes and his own particular brand of quiet authority. Emmerich never entirely stopped finding reasons to be in the kitchen. Finn collected rocks for 3 more years before shifting his devotion to maps, which Bonnie considered an entirely reasonable progression and supplied accordingly. The wolf that had been quiet in her for so long found her voice again slowly, over the course of that first year. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in increments, like light returning after a long winter. She ran the Dunmere forest sometimes in the early mornings, when the mist was still low in the trees, and the world had not yet decided what shape the day would take. Evander ran beside her. He was still the largest thing in any forest he entered, still black as ink against the silver morning, and he was still, and he was present, and he never once asked her to be less than exactly what she was. Her father had hoped she would never need to find out how much iron she had. She had found out. It had not broken her. It had only shown her what she was made of, and what she was made of, it turned out, was more than enough. More than enough to fight. More than enough to choose. More than enough to stay.